Hello, my name is Malcolm Norman, and today I will be presenting to you the causes of the American War for Independence. So, the French and Indian War. Both the French and the British claimed the Ohio River Valley, but in the 1750s it was largely unsettled by Europeans. To discourage British settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, the French built a series of forts and trading posts along the Great Lakes and down the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. During this time period, Native Americans tended to play the two European powers against each other so that they could receive gifts, guns, and ammunition. They preferred the French over the British. In 1754, the Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie sent colonial troops under the command of George Washington to drive the French out of the region claimed by the Ohio Company. Washington built Fort Necessity and attacked a detachment of French troops. The French maintained an advantage until 1757, when William Pitt, as Secretary of State, took command of the effort. Initially, he allowed the British officers to impress colonists into the army. Also, they were able to seize supplies from farmers and businessmen without compensation. These actions bred resentment among the colonists and the British government. Pontiac's Rebellion. So, due to the British victory, the Native Americans could no longer play France and Britain against each other. In spring 1763, a variety of Native American groups attacked British forts and colonial settlements throughout the Great Lakes region and Ohio River Valley. The attack was known as Pontiac's Rebellion. The Native Americans hoped that they could weaken the British and lure the French back to the region, but failed to capture the three largest British posts in the region. Without a European supplier, they ran low on gunpowder, and the rebellion ended by 1764. Here's a picture of Pontiac's Rebellion, and this is clearly the Native Americans. Well, right here are the British. So the Proclamation of 1763. The attacks by the Native Americans became expensive for the British to defeat, so they sought solutions to keep peace with the Native Americans. In order not to exacerbate the natives, the British government tried to restrain the flow of settlers west of the Appalachians. They issued the Proclamation of 1763, which ordered colonial settlers to remain east of the Appalachians. They had fought the war for the whole purpose of gaining the land they were now forbidden to settle on. In response, the colonists ignored the proclamation and continued to settle anyways. This, along with the rising debt, convinced British officials that they needed to take more direct control of their American colonies. This whole area is where they were forbidden to travel to. The Grenville Acts. Colonial merchants grew rich from trade, often smuggling or bribing officials to avoid duties or bribing officials to avoid taxes on imports. In 1764, the new Prime Minister, George Grenville, proposed raising money by collecting duties already in effect. The law was known as the Sugar Act. It lowered the duty on foreign molasses. It also assigned customs officers and created courts to collect the duties and prosecute smugglers. Grenville hoped that these measures would encourage colonists to pay the tax. In early 1765, Parliament passed another unpopular law, the Quartering Act. This act required the colonies to provide housing and supplies for the British troops stationed there after the French and Indian War. Colonists complained, but most went along with the changes because they accepted Parliament's right to regulate trade and provide for defense. In March 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which required colonists to pay a tax on almost all printed materials, including newspapers, books, court documents, contracts, and land deeds. The intention of this bill was to raise money. This was the first time that Parliament had imposed a direct tax within the colonies. The colonists angrily protested the Stamp Act, claiming that it threatened their prosperity and liberty. Colonial leaders questioned Parliament's right to tax the colonies directly. They argued that the colonies had no representation in Parliament, so Parliament had no right to tax them. Many colonists thought that the Stamp Act revealed a conspiracy by British officials to destroy American liberties. The Daughters of Liberty. The Daughters of Liberty displayed their loyalty by supporting the non-importation of British goods during the American Revolution. They refused to drink British tea and used their skills to weave yarn and wool into cloth, which made America less dependent on British textiles. Some refused to receive gentlemen callers who were not sympathetic to the Patriot cause. The Daughters of Liberty proved that women's involvement in politics could be beneficial to the country. The Daughters of Liberty consisted of women who displayed their patriotism by participating in boycotts of British goods following the passage of the Townshend Acts. To the right, there is a picture of Martha Washington, who was a leader of the Daughters of Liberty. She was also George Washington's wife. In January 1770, 538 Boston women signed an agreement vowing not to drink tea as long as it was taxed. In 1774, these women helped influence a decision made by Continental Congress to boycott all British goods, which was due in large part to the Daughters of Liberty, who were determined to reach demands for the homemade clothing. The Sons of Liberty. Those who opposed the British taxes called themselves patriots. To lead the popular protests, some men formed associations known as the Sons of Liberty. Their most famous leader was Boston's Samuel Adams, a cousin of John Adams. They attacked supporters and burned down the collector's office. Parliament provided military protection for tax collectors and other government officials. It was felt that Parliament was attacking their liberty, and Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. In response to the Townshend Acts, the colonists revived their protests, boycotts, and street violence. British customs officials abused their power. In an already tense situation, customs officers seized the merchant ship Liberty in June 1768 for smuggling. The ship belonged to John Hancock, a wealthy merchant and a prominent colonial politician. The seizure set off riots against the customs officers. To suppress the riots, the Crown sent 4,000 troops to occupy Boston, a city of only 16,000 people. For over a year, the presence of British troops inflamed popular anger, especially because the poorly paid soldiers competed with unskilled workers for jobs. One night in March 1770, a group of colonists hurled snowballs and rocks at British soldiers guarding the customs house. The nervous soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 colonists. The dead included Crispus Attucks, a sailor who may have been an escaped slave of mixed Indian and African ancestry. Under the leadership of Samuel Adams, patriots called the killings the Boston Massacre. To the right is a painting of the Boston Massacre done by Paul Revere, and he referred to the Boston Massacre as the Bloody Massacre, which is stated on the painting. Samuel Adams later organized a network of local committees of correspondence throughout Massachusetts. The committees provided leadership and promoted cooperation. By 1773, several other colonies had created committees which helped build colonial unity. Parliament backed down and withdrew the troops. Redcoats competed with the colonists for jobs. On December 16, 1773, Bostonians disguised themselves as Native Americans, boarded 3 British ships laden with tea, and dumped tea into the Boston harbor. This was a protest against British taxes. The tea boycott worsened financial problems for the already struggling British East India Company. To help the company and encourage the colonists to pay the tax, Parliament passed a law allowing the company to sell directly to the colonists. This made their tea cheaper than the smuggled tea, even with a tax. Instead of buying the cheaper tea, the colonists protested that the British were trying to trick them into paying the tax. To the right is a painting of the Boston Tea Party, where tea is clearly being dumped into the Boston harbor by the colonists. The Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts were also known as the Coercive Acts, were passed by Parliament in 1774 to control the colonies. Parliament closed the port to trade until inhabitants paid for the destroyed tea, including the tax. They also increased the power of the governor at the expense of the elected assembly and the town meetings. To enforce these measures, the British sent warships and troops to Boston. In addition to closing the port, the acts forced colonists to house British troops and allowed British officials to be tried in Britain for crimes committed in the colonies. In addition, the Quebec Act extended Canada's southern border, cutting off lands claimed by several colonies. The colonists rejected the idea that the British could shut down trade and change colonial governments at will. In rural Massachusetts, people reacted to the British actions with violence. Armed with clubs and guns, they forced the courts of law to shut down. They also assaulted anyone who accepted an office under the governor or spoke in favor of obeying Parliament. They coated some victims in hot tar and feathers, a punishment both humiliating and painful. In defiance of the ban on town meetings, delegates from the towns of Suffolk County, Massachusetts met at private homes in Dedham on September 6, 1774, and in Milton on September 9th, to plan resistance against the Intolerable Acts. The convention recommended measures that included calling a provincial congress, withholding public funds from the treasury, non-intercourse with Britain, Ireland, and the West Indies, and raising a defensive militia. In the fall of 1774, delegates from every colony except Georgia met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for the First Continental Congress. To pressure Parliament to withdraw the Intolerable Acts, the delegates announced a boycott of all British imports. Throughout the colonies, the Patriots established local committees and provincial congresses to enforce the boycotts. In effect, the Patriots established new governments that bypassed Parliament and the Crown. By including common shopkeepers, artisans, and farmers, the committees expanded the ranks of the politically active. By 1774, Patriot John Adams had decided that he already lived in a new country named America. He also believed that Americans could unite to defeat the British. But Adams was ahead of most colonists, who still hoped to remain within the British Empire, provided that Parliament would revoke the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts, and stop trying to tax them. Far from blaming the king, most colonists still expected that he would side with them against Parliament. Within 2 years, however, events would prove Adams right. This is a picture of the First Continental Congress taking place in Philadelphia, where 12 delegates are representing the colonies. On April 19, 1775, west of Boston, a battle in Lexington and Concord took place. Thomas Gage sent troops to arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams in Lexington and seize Patriot weapons in Concord. Paul Revere warned off the approaching British troops. Local Patriot troops rally. Patriot fighters included militia, full-time farmers, and part-time soldiers. By morning, 70 Patriots were on the Lexington Green. Britain marched in at dawn and the militia dispersed. Someone fired a shot, and next thing you know, 8 Patriots were dead. The Redcoats went to Concord. Hundreds of Minutemen lined the roads, firing at the British from behind trees and stone walls. 200 British troops were killed or wounded. Britain got to Boston in the late afternoon. Thousands of militiamen rushed to confine the British troops in the city. Provincial assemblies of Patriots seized control of the New England colonies, and Loyalists fled to take refuge in Boston. In May 1775, delegates from all the colonies assembled in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. Congress assumed responsibility for the war. Armed volunteers from Middle and South colonies marched north to join the Patriot siege of Boston. New England needed Virginia's help to win the war. George Washington led the Continental Army. He was also a colonial officer in the French and Indian War. Some members of the Continental Congress wanted to declare American independence from Britain. Most constituents were not ready to do so. Colonists still hoped to remain within the British Empire, but without paying taxes to Parliament. In July, the Olive Branch Petition was presented to King George III. It reaffirmed the colonists' allegiance to the king, but not to Parliament. The king rejected it and sent more troops. To the right is a picture of John Hancock, who was the president of the Second Continental Congress. The Declaration of Independence. In 1776, Congress selected a committee to draft a document declaring American independence and explaining the reasons for it. On July 2nd, Congress voted that America was free. On July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was approved. Thomas Jefferson drew up the Declaration based upon Thomas Paine's ideas to denounce the king as a tyrant who made American independence necessary. The Declaration also advanced the bold idea that all men are created equal. Congress embraced the Enlightenment ideas that all men are born with natural rights that cannot be taken away by a government, also known as unalienable rights. Many of the signers owned slaves. The idea of equality would inspire future generations of Americans, including slaves, to make a better, more equal society. No colony in the Americas had yet won independence from a European empire. Fighting the British for independence would pit the poorly organized colonists against the greatest military power on earth. To the right is a picture of Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson signing the Declaration of Independence. There were 4 parts of the Declaration of Independence, the first part being the preamble, which explained the purpose of the document. Second, the document of natural rights, which explained rights given by God, also alienable rights. Third was the Bill of Indictment, which explained how Britain and King George violated their natural rights. And finally, if Britain violated rights, the U.S. colonies were free to break away. And the audience that this was speaking to was the entire world.